This event is part of an ongoing effort to promote the discussion around the review, both for the renewal of the appointment and promotion, and to facilitate building mutual mentoring relationships among faculty members. Although Parsons is the driving force in organizing this event, this invites everybody. This invites all the full-time faculty across the university. While continuing on the conversation around the last year's topic, which was peer review, this year we aim to provide further information and share insights as to what it means to evidence and validate various forms of research, scholarship, and creative practice. And with this objective in mind, we have organized 9 panel discussions throughout the day. These panels will be partitioned into 3 session blocks, 1 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. The morning session will focus on sharing information of what kinds of research we do and also exchanging experiences and tips about how to pursue meaningful Rscp projects. And the second and the third session in the afternoon are more geared toward talking about how to build credible evidence for peer review and how to put it together to construct personal narratives for your promotional dossier. These sessions will feature 25 faculty members from Parsons and across the university. We also invited outside speakers from universities near us. I would like to sincerely thank our panelists today for their generous time and significant and important contribution to the event. Thank you also for Provost Office for funding. We could not have put it together without all these supports and help. As much as it is an opportunity to share information, we like it to be an opportunity to build community around research. Although the event is structured to have a set theme for each session, the format is informal and conversational. Each panelist will speak about 5 to 8 minutes, drawing on their personal research and institutional knowledge related to the review process at the new school and also in their field at large. And we will then open the floor for questions, comments, and ideas from the audience. It will be difficult to provide crystal clear answers of all the questions that you might have, but we hope this event to be a small stepping stone toward promoting the culture of collaborative and supportive mutual mentoring relationships among faculty. Thomas, do you have anything to add to this? Otherwise, I will turn the table to Thomas, who will introduce the panel and the panelists for our first session.
Good morning. Thank you for coming out on a cold and snowy morning. First, I'd like to mention that there are faculty mentorship grant deadlines coming up on March 20th. We'll be mentioning this throughout the day. There are 2 types of grants available: mini grants of up to $1,200 awarded to principal full-time faculty members for projects that expand their mentoring support in areas such as teaching, research, tenure, and work-life balance. Please do consider applying. There's also team grants of up to $5,000 to provide support for departmental, college-level, and interdisciplinary mentoring projects involving teams of 4 or more faculty members. These are listed on the Provost's website. We can hand out or we can send out the link to everybody in our follow-up. So please do consider applying. Also like to welcome our colleagues who will be watching the panels today on tape. We have a number of colleagues who haven't been able to make it who have expressed interest in watching online. Thank you to Red Dog Productions for being here and for your work. We appreciate it. Very happy to have our first group of panelists. I'd like to introduce you first to Eleni Litt from the Provost Office, Simone Douglas from the Parsons School of Art, Media, and Technology, and Matt Robb from Parsons School of Design Strategies. First, I'd like to invite Eleni up to speak about EE and tenure.
Good morning, everyone. I want to thank Thomas and Erin for inviting me, and I'm here not representing the Provost's office, but really in my role as Assistant Provost for full-time faculty affairs, and also secondarily as an independent scholar and painter in my own right. And I just want to talk for about 5 minutes about what the review process looks like from my perspective from the Provost Office. I've been involved with the full-time faculty review process since 2009, and as you know, from the perspective of UPRC and UTRC, which are committees that I support and work closely with, the focus is on procedure, right? So we hear that there's this distinction between the substance of the review and all of the procedure surrounding the review. But we know that all of us know that just like form and content or any other kind of binary distinction, it's a good conceptual distinction. But when it comes to the actual review, the actual dossier, the actual conversation, it's really rather difficult to disentangle substance from procedure and form from content. And so that is what some of the work that's done in UPRC and UTRC represents, is trying to disentangle some of the threads to see very clearly what the evidence is for certain substance and what the procedure is regarding the process. So I want to say a couple of things about what a good case looks like with a focus on evidence, and then I want to say a few things about challenges, and then I'll end with some comments about resources. So in terms of what a case looks like, the best case has a personal statement that references evidence. So the personal statement is the arc of someone's work over time, and throughout the statement is speaking to evidence which is also supplied in the dossier. And every level of the review, not starting from the personal statement and then advancing to the letters from each step of the review, focuses on the link between the statements put forward and the evidence that's there to support them. You know, an obvious, here would be a very obvious type of example. A statement is made that the faculty member has international stature in his or her field. So what is the evidence for that? If there's no international publications or there's no international exhibits, what is the evidence that supports an international frame of reference rather than a national or local or whatever? So that would be a most obvious one. So having said that, there's still kind of some basic challenges in the review of the dossier. And one of the primary ones, and I'm sure that you've all encountered this in your own experience, either being reviewed or serving as reviewers, is that the very same evidence can be used to support opposite arguments. So that really makes things very challenging. So you have all of this evidence, and depending on how the case is argued, that very same evidence can suggest a very positive recommendation, and that very same evidence might lead to a more challenging or not successful recommendation. So that's why all of the documents that are part of a dossier and the review process need to be well crafted, of course. They need to be evidence-based, and they need to be well argued. And then last but not least would be that kind of ineffable, not only well argued, but convincingly argued. And so sometimes, you know, we'll see, and I know that others will speak to this, we'll see cases that are clearly what one might call slam dunk. Like, this is a slam dunk case. And yet the argument hasn't been made. So what then is to be done? Anyway, so I'll just leave that as an open question. So just to close out the few minutes that I'm speaking, I just wanted to switch gears and remind folks of the kind of resources that are available from the Provost Office. We update annually the Provost Office website with respect to reviews. I'm not sure how many people actually do look at it, but I do encourage you to go to the Provost Office website and look at, you know, just click on the box Faculty Reviews, and there is a timeline, and there are the Dossier Guidelines. And I would not only welcome you to look at those from the perspective of those being reviewed, but also from the perspective of those of you serving as reviewers, and especially to email me if there are errors or inconsistencies that you notice, because that will help us make it better. You'll notice in the timeline that it continues to be aspirational, with dossiers generally due from the divisions by December, and then the Provost Office and Central Committees doing the work in the spring. Other resources include the Full-Time Faculty Handbook, which has a lot of information about reviews. It's intentionally more generic with the hope that the divisional supplements will contextualize local practice more concretely, and that's in the works. There's the Selden dossier preparation workshops, which we do every year in June. And finally, a lot of faculty do call me and come talk to me behind the scenes, and that continues to be a kind of totally confidential, off the record, so anyone is welcome to come talk to me about any concern at any level, and it will never go beyond me, and I will basically try to help you solve your concerns or provide you the information you need or direct you to those who could help you better than I. So I think I'll stop there. I hope that wasn't more than 5 or 4 minutes.
I thank you to Thomas and Aaron for organizing this. It's a really magnificent thing and much needed by the university, and as you know, an area of crucial need. I'm here in the capacity of my role, which I just rotated out of, in fact, last semester, of working on the UPRC, and I served on the UPRC for 6 years, 3 of which I chaired, and then in the final semester crossed over with Clive Dilnott, and we co-chaired as I exited and he entered into that role. So I'm speaking to that, and I've been asked to talk specifically about RSCP in relation to tenure and the UPRC. I want to give a little bit of background to that. Before I came to Parsons, I worked at another university. There are other ones out there. And part of the work I did there was working on a government review of how do you look at RSCP specifically in relation to creative practice. And so the government did a survey of Research One universities, and Sydney College of the Arts, which part of the University of Sydney, was requested to do that, and we were put up against the School of Medicine. And the really beautiful thing about that was that they thought, of course, that those involved in creative practice, design and art practice, would come out far lower than those involved in medicine, who had a very clear research trajectory. And so we spent months compiling data and looking at how do we measure those things and how do we evidence those practices. And much to our delight, we came out ahead with much less funding than our colleagues in medicine as evidencing creative research practice. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. So one of I know that the UPRC has a kind of slightly mysterious and secret role at the university, but I want to say that having served on it for that long, it was a pleasure and a privilege to read the research that's taking place across the university. And it's rare that you can put pleasure, privilege, and committee in the one sentence and feel genuine about it. It really was. And so as a result of that, as you know, and working with you has been fantastic. As a result of that, we see so many dossiers coming through, and as Eleni was referencing, you see amazing cases come through, but it's been written up in a way which is not clear in the dossier how to read the research. So I've put together a one-pager today, which I hope gives some insight into things that we look for at the UPRC level. I want to make really clear that our role is procedural. So the decision is made at divisional level, at the APTs, etc., across the new school. Our job is purely to look at that the evidence supports the outcome, the decision reached by the APTs. It's really crucial that you present your creative practice and research very clearly in your dossier. And what we sometimes see is that many projects are rolled into one, and it's hard to untangle one project from another. So this seems like a really reductive way of doing it, but it also makes it very easy for the committees to read what it is you've been doing. So for each work or project or publication that you're evidencing in your dossier, I would recommend that you undertake these 3 steps. And so the first step is the creative research project description rationale. What is the content of the project you work on? What is the conceptual basis of it? What was the thrust of the book? What was the exhibition that you did? What is the ideas that informed that? So where did it start from and where did it end? What form was the outcome? If I just use my own practice, therefore, it involved, this research led to an outcome of an installation in a particular environment, or it involved 10 photographs, or it was a book, or whatever the outcome of that was. Really crucial, were you the sole author of that work? Many of us are involved in collaborative practice, and there is no shame laying claim to that collaborative practice. People forget to mention who their collaborators are. There is no doubt someone sitting on one of the many committees that your work will pass through over the years of review that will know that. And so if you forget to mention that, then it comes up as a red flag, which is really unnecessary, because we support collaborative practice. So talk about that. If it was collaborative, what was your role within that? And who were the other collaborators and what were their roles? Now, sometimes we see candidates who, it's really hard to untangle who did what specifically, for example, in architectural practice or in a couple of artist practices that I can think of, or in co-authored. And it's okay to talk about it in that way, but you do need to kind of talk about how you reach those ideas together. The next section you should go on, and again for each single project, is the context and research dissemination and public outcome. And this is the evidencing. So you have these magnificent ideas, but how was that evidenced? So what was the exhibition? When was the exhibition? Where was the exhibition? There's a difference between having something at a major public institution and then having something at grassroots level, which can also be really important, by the way. Were you part of a larger body of work? So did you have a chapter in a book? Were you part of a curated exhibition? Who was the curator? Was it a solo exhibition, etc.? Publication, performance, was it a patent? Was it site-specific? Was it a community-based project? So tell us that. And when did that occur and where? And the final part of that is the critical review and outcomes. So this is the evidencing of the importance of the project that you undertook. And this, of course, is a fast-moving thing because we have the traditional scholarly outcomes of it was a publication, and then we have the new forms of evidencing which occur in new media. So talk to us about it. Tell us about the publications, the articles, the reviews about the work, not that you've written, that other people have written about your work, the conferences that you've been asked to participate in as a result of that research which you undertook, the visiting lecturer stints that you held or researcher stints that you held, the guest lectures that you've given on that work, the grants that you were awarded. All of this starts to evidence the importance, the significance of what you're doing, the collaborations as a result of what you did. Now that may be a sole authored work, but you may have then been invited to partake in a larger project as a result of that. Your works were collected by, and then and a really nice segue into your teaching section is Rscp Led Teaching, so research-led teaching. You may then have proposed a course based on the work that you've developed in Rscp. Now that kind of dovetails into teaching, so you don't want to confuse the two, but you can simply make, it's really lovely when your administration and teaching and Rscp cross over, and it's very important to the university. So I'm happy to answer questions about that, and I won't take up more than my time allocation. But I also want to say that I'm really happy and available to support my colleagues. So please come find me. I'm happy to read your dossiers and talk to you about these ideas. Many people have done that for me. And I'm also working in the role of helping the university develop a thesis on mentoring, to put it that way. So we're hoping to instigate a little bit more about that this semester and going into next semester. And on that note, I want to add that in that role, I want to hear from you what we need to do for you. And I want to hear it from the faculty. We can second guess it, we can do surveys, but it's more important, and sometimes you get the real truth if you come talk to us in person. So please reach out to me if we're missing out on things. I want to hear about it. Thanks.
Good morning. And thanks to my colleagues, Eleni and Simone. My name is Matthew Robb. I'm here partly as myself an RTA faculty member, a renewable term faculty member, and also because I have in the, 8 years that I've been full-time at Parsons, I work at Parsons, one of the schools there, I've played a series of administrative and leadership roles that has allowed me to sort of have a perspective on these issues as they bear on my colleagues. I've directed one of the programs in the School of Design Strategies, the BBA business degree undergraduate program, for a number of years, and I'm now serving as the associate dean of that school. In addition to that, I have a role editing a journal that our school produces, this Journal of Design Strategies, where I typically work with a full-time faculty colleague to develop the theme and articulate the content. So through all of those sort of roles and functions, I have the following kind of perspective on things. First of all, most of us are RTA in the university. That's the biggest category. That category can be spun a couple different ways. There's critiques to be made, but for many of us, it has allowed us to have a kind of academic career that might not otherwise be possible, and the university has been able to, avail itself of the energy and expertise of many, I think hundreds of our colleagues, and so in that sense, there's a kind of win-win logic to the RTA, the contract structure. It does bring, I think, some special burdens for us. Maybe before I get to those, I think there's some relationship. Conceptually, this is a little distinct, but also I think not totally unrelated, that this is a university that has explicitly committed itself to promoting interdisciplinary kind of work, collaborative work, not being locked into traditional disciplinary categories. The RTA category, although it's a different kind of category, has maybe something to do, since it's written in a kind of squishy way, how you frame and position yourself and justify your ongoing appointment or reappointment, for example, as an RTA member is more open and, you could say, vague or more subject to individual circumstances than it may be the case for most tenure-track faculty members, where the parameters and path to success is a little more concrete and clear. So that's sort of the only point I wanted to make. As renewable term faculty members, there's a kind of onus on us to make our value and what we're doing research-wise and also more generally in terms of the rest of our obligations to the university, make those understood and understandable by our peers. I mean, we just heard from a couple of the people that would end up looking over a reappointment application. There's many others. And this is a takeaway from my experience with my colleagues, my immediate colleagues and some others a little further afield, is that there's some room for improvement in this area. Situating your work, contextualizing what you're doing. That could be on the local context of, say, an application for funding. I think most divisions do this, but Parsons does make available small amounts of money that are competitively applied for by our colleagues, and then there's a committee that doles out modest sums. This is like startup kind of money to help get a project started. In that kind of immediate context, where the applications are on the scale of a couple pages, or in a more substantive context like a reappointment, where the personal narrative that Eleni mentioned would be combined with the other kinds of requisite documentation. In either of those kinds of contexts, I think that the people that I know that I've worked with, there's more that could be done in the way of situating the work. And I know that's sort of the theme of this entire day, so I'm not going to get out ahead of, I know we have entire panels on this topic. I'm essentially just endorsing the whole idea and recognizing that this is an area where there could be some improvement. What I mean by situate and sort of motivate your work, let's just take the context of a specific research project. A faculty member would like to do that, is proposing, maybe asking for some money. It could be a few $100s, a few $1,000s at the most, and they're sort of describing what the project is. Just as Simone said, in the context of the more heavy-duty reappointment, you need to be able to say some of those things about, what is the project, what's the context, what's the content, what are the outcomes. But this is all very concrete material. What I want to contribute before I stop talking is that there can be a conceptual kind of contextualizing that can help your ideas get taken up and sort of understood. This book may be familiar to some of you. We use it all the time with our undergraduates. It's written, co-authored by the former literary critic Wayne Booth. Very useful for all of us. It's not like the only good book out there. It's not like I get a kickback from promoting it or anything, but it's just a useful one in the sense that it organizes the process of developing a research project, standing it up, getting yourself to understand why it deserves to exist, and being able to articulate that to other people. Just on page 88 to 91, there's a list of ways that you can sort of take up or put yourself into dialogue with something that's already there. So if the project is, I want to investigate the history of some kind of experience of some people. The main conventional wisdom says that experience of these people is such and so. However, I'm going to bring in new evidence that shows we need to modify our understanding. Or this person articulated this thesis with respect to that population in this area. I'm going to see if the thesis obtains in a different geographical area, or with respect to a different time period, or something like that. The conventional wisdom says that this is the way things work. I'm trying to think of somebody who's really radical. Foucault. The conventional wisdom says that medicine has developed to actually cure and treat people, but I, Foucault, have been able to uncover that, in fact, the discourse has helped to create and, in fact, reify new kinds of disease that wouldn't have had to be defined in those ways. So a radical shift of perspective. This book just contains a list of ways that you can situate your idea with respect to something else that's already out there. That's a good, common sense, obvious way to make your project comprehensible to others. It's part of being in a university. I think the life of a university, sort of a personal opinion, is in dialogue to some extent. And even though many of us don't do work or creative practice that has a discursive form, it might be painting, it might be CAD diagrams for architect. Nevertheless, being able to use your words, as I say to my son, to express and articulate what you're doing, what your hopes and goals are, and to situate that into some kind of context of similar practitioners. That's, whether the university has a right to expect that or not, it's just a prudential thing to try to put some effort into the framing. So I have very, very sophisticated colleagues, very expert in special fields. Sometimes they're so specialized and good, they have a hard time explaining back to the uneducated but still interested peers what they're doing or why it matters. It's good to put some effort into that sort of preliminary work, even if it is not the work itself. Some faculty members, as already indicated, have sometimes tended to inflate their role in a project. That's not useful. That we're all peer evaluating ourselves one way or another, because our senior faculty members end up on these on APT and senior other kinds of university level committees that really are vetting us. And so, that's just part of the logic of the university. That's a good thing. We want to be able to talk with our peers. But that's all that I really wanted to say. But I did want to recommend this book among others as a useful one for. And it's not just for undergraduates. It would help most of my colleagues and myself to sort of set the work, whether it's a research project or an overall reappointment application, into a kind of setting that makes it easier to take up.
I just want to add one thing that came back to me as you were talking, Rob. I was lucky enough to serve when I started on the UPC with the legendary Jay Bernstein, and it came back to me one thing he said, which is that we want you to succeed, and all of this is about to help you support you through the promotion. There's many pathways to promotion across the university, and tenure and EE and is only one part of that. There's rank reviews and there's many other ways to seek promotion. Separately or simultaneously. But I do want to emphasize that this is in support of you succeeding in that, and that is our interest.
I just wanted to add something to what Matt and Simone both said, which is about the personal statement for creative practitioners. As a painter or anyone who's doing creative practice, on some level the work speaks for itself. And that points to a very sincere challenge in making that translation into a verbal, discursive narrative about the work. And I know sometimes we talk about that translation and it becomes a bit of a cliche. Oh, artists, the work speaks for itself and they don't really know how to talk about it. And I think we all recognize that and we honor that that is a skill in and of itself, making that kind of translation. So even artists working in isolation are it's still dialogical because they're working with a whole history that precedes them. That was just one small point. The other small point is about RTA. And I think Matt really, zeroed in on some key kind of contradictions. So on the one hand, that appointment category provides the university with great flexibility because RTA appointment is also based on institutional need. But at the same time, we know there's a kind of challenging, kind of contradictory reality to that, in that we have a number of faculty who are quite traditional and are in RTA lines because there aren't tenure lines. So we want to just be transparent in our understanding of those types of contradictions, even as we want to appreciate the distinctions that different appointment types provide.
Thank you all for your contribution.
Thank you very much to Thomas and Aaron for picking up the conversation from last year and carrying it forward. As they mentioned, I had helped to organize last year's event, What is Peer Review? And right around this time last year, it was February 28th, 2014, Parsons Academic Promotions and Tenure Committee hosted an all-day mutual mentoring event, What is Peer Review? Designed for full-time faculty across rank and categories and focusing on practice-based learning. The event aimed to raise awareness on the range of options for peer review and dissemination of Rscp across a faculty member's career trajectory at Parsons and the new school. Panels included moderators and followed two formats, conversational or espresso presentations that sought to identify distinctions and overlaps among traditional, practice-based, juried, curated, and online modes of peer review. A central aim was to assist full-time faculty identify how they might, if interested, form meaningful and unexpected connections among Rscp, the classroom, and program and curriculum development, and translate this work into disseminated peer-reviewed scholarship. There was a spirited discussion of what constitutes peer review, its permutations and relative virtues and vices. Building on these discussions, an afternoon session with one keynote speaker and then two other panels dedicated to a better communal understanding of the scholarship of teaching offered case examples and in-process pursuits that reflected how this category of Rscp in the New School Faculty Handbook might apply at Parsons and the New School. As we discussed, it is likely an exception rather than a rule that a Parsons faculty member would pursue scholarship of teaching as a field of inquiry as defined by such organizations as the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. Yet, by discussing what scholarship of teaching is and is not, faculty became, it is hoped, more aware of the options of Rscp available across their career trajectories at Parsons and the New School, while recognizing that they may potentially misrepresent scholarship of teaching as well. There was a concern about that. So therefore, we had, for the scholarship of teaching portion of the event, the planning group invited an external expert, Dr. Anna Neumann, from Columbia University to complement presentations by Parsons New School faculty who are currently or have already, wittingly or not, performed facets of scholarship of teaching in their own Rscp. Dr. Newman's presentation provided vocabulary for this emerging field, providing a point of departure for discussing how different aspects of scholarship of teaching, philosophy of pedagogy, teaching research methodologies, curriculum and program development, might offer pertinent modes of scholarship for Parsons faculty, whether as a one-off article or a larger research agenda based on an individual faculty member's interest. Through this conference this year now builds on last year's desire to examine the range of RSCP pursuits, their modalities, while contextualizing, evidencing, and validating our RSCP efforts. As further support to this end, my school associate dean colleagues, Lucille Tanasis, Matt Robb, Yvonne Watson, Lorraine Carafel, and I are currently revising the call for school-based and cross-school funds and developing online faculty resources to clarify how to frame our RSCP project proposals. We are simplifying the criteria. Right now, we're imagining it as 3 concentric circles. At the center is the individual faculty member's RSCP, the unfolding story of her arc of inquiry. The next ring is the full-time faculty's program, school, division, and the overall university. And the outermost ring is one's field, discipline, profession, the world beyond. However we pursue our RSCP, personally, we must each be able to articulate how we cross-navigate these spheres of activity in our RSCP. And as to set this image a little bit more firmly, perhaps, as hopefully a useful image in the mind, at last week's SCE Aftertaste Symposium, Inside Imagination, which was hosted by Jansara Ruth and the MFA Interior Design program, we heard from the green chemist John Warner, who cautioned how inflexible forms of peer review can lead to institutional risk aversion and risk aversion to imaginative inquiry by anxiously framing what is not RSCP. He also provided a powerful image of the physics for how things actually work in the universe on an atomic scale. Atoms don't simply bounce off of one another, as we might imagine, as we've learned to imagine, but rather they are attracted to one another, and when they bump into one another, they pause and transmit influence, creating something new. That's how atoms and larger molecules are formed. And if you take that image of concentric rings, then imagine that each of us is a sort of a module, an atom floating within this institution. We've already drifted toward this institution through a certain degree of affinity, and through those outer concentric rings, we bump into and stick to one another and form larger groupings based on how we navigate our careers and life here and beyond the institution. So where one might sardonically joke that a university is a place where a bunch of smart people like to gather together and take turns managing one another, doing so by establishing a boundary of what RSCP is not, I'd rather work at a place of convivial inquiry where our encounters are more like atoms that keeps research and inquiry as an open question, constantly reformulating itself. Thank you.
I think I'm a good example of a faculty that has really taken full advantage of the support that the Parsons has given in terms of research, funding through the various means that have been mentioned already in the panel and by Robert's comments as well. Sort of looking back, I've been through 2 phases of reappointment at this point. I'm renewable term faculty in the School of Fashion. And I think when I first thought of this opportunity that came up, I think it was back in 2010, for us to have the opportunity to apply for research assistant funding, that was completely new to me, and I think to a lot of colleagues that are potentially new to that sphere of research. So I made that application and was supported internally by, at that time, the Director of Academic Affairs, Yvonne Watson, encouraged to take the work that I was doing in the classroom and to really sort of contextualize that towards potentially a book proposal. That's something that I'd actually never even thought of prior to that moment. And so it was really quite seminal to have that conversation and realize, yes, this can now go out into the wider context and live within a sphere of influence that will then come back to, actually influence the field that we're inhabiting. So through research assistant funding, I was able to go through 2 phases of that, and the outcome of that was the publishing of my first book, Fashion Thinking, Creative Approaches to Design, in 2013. And what that book did was really kind of did speak to me, certainly as an individual, as a faculty member within the context of the institution, really helping me to contextualize my teaching practice. So what I was doing and what many of us do day to day, sitting in front of students and helping them make sense of their process, no matter what field we're in, suddenly became really critical to me to kind of speak about that in form of a textbook that would speak within the field of fashion. Because I think for us, in terms of fashion design and the field of textbooks and work that is out there speaking about how we teach fashion design, there's been a very rote delivery of that and a very narrow perspective on how fashion designers actually work. I think that's supported by a number of different media situations, but we don't just actually sketch and then make and have this very kind of siloed approach to fashion and to making. And I think that what my book was pointing to was that students, indeed designers, really approach design from from a variety of standpoints, whether that's textiles, whether that's draping on the form, whether that is sketching, whether that's all of the above, and they're navigating in and out of those processes all the time and inhabiting those worlds. So my book essentially followed 9 designers through that process and really pointed to 9 different perspectives of work, and also pointed to a number of truths that I think have come through this process, in that we don't actually inhabit one's way of working throughout a whole phase of a project. As we all know, as practitioners, we are moving in and out of any number of processes at the same time towards that final outcome. So it was really a book that helps students think about not only how they worked, but what it was that they were trying to communicate through their process. And I think that the textbook actually has now been adopted by a number of schools internationally, and it's been fantastic for me. I was at a fashion issues conference last year in Stockholm to actually see the principal from Beckman's College in Stockholm actually have the book in her slideshow and reference that as saying that it's a critical text for their faculty, and has really become this phenomenal tool for them to actually impact their curriculum in the ways that I was really hoping it would do. So that was really sort of really successful outcome for me. But I think that, so it's kind of just to recap on that, it's really something that it grew out of a personal practice. It was contextualizing teaching practice, and then it was implementing that to the wider, certainly university, because at the same time we were also rolling out our transitional curriculum in the BFA, and I happened to take on the role of BFA program director, coincidentally. So I think the book was also an opportunity to kind of align and shine a light on our practices and the move that actually has taken place in fashion from a very singular delivery of curriculum towards a much wider breadth of delivery of approaches to fashion design. And then, as I mentioned, also then it's moved out into the field. So the second project that I have now undertaken, my current research project, is in phase, so I guess it's entering phase 3. So it's entitled Dress and Emotion, and again, I applied for research funding back in 2013 and received now 2 phases of support in that context towards really looking into dress and how we're approaching, how we're curating ourselves. Do we have some people are curating themselves in terms of a uniform? Some people have very distinctive ways of presenting themselves to the world. Others may be hiding. There's multiple ways that we're sort of curating ourselves. This grew out of a personal, again, sort of inquiry into my own trajectory of dress over the last decade or 2, musings about that and conversations. I think I just wanted to encourage, if there are junior faculty, I think that are maybe struggling to understand what research is, certainly maybe within fashion because it's fairly new, at least here in the US, for us to be thinking about what that is. It can be literally as simple as, something that you're really personally interested in. And having those conversations with your peers could suddenly validate, yes, this is something that you should investigate. So I think I would just encourage us together as peers to have conversations. That's the simplest thing I would say, because School of Fashion put up together some sort of work in progress presentations last spring. And I will say, when Timo and Greg asked me, I was like, it's really in a very, rough draft state. And essentially I had done a series of surveys. I had data. I had a lot of ideas of where it could go, but the research was kind of at a sort of standstill. I had multiple, directions that it could take. But I think by actually being encouraged to present, even in a very raw state, it was really, really meaningful because people were incredibly encouraging. I got a lot of great feedback, a lot of support, a lot of, affirmation in the direction that I should take. And it kind of was a catalyst for me to then work over the summer and say, right, I'm going to get towards an outcome. I'm going to have an actual physical, tangible outcome by, fall of 2014. So I think those types of opportunities to sort of disseminate your ideas, even if they're not fully fleshed out, are really meaningful. These are just images that I'll just click through. So what resulted in that sort of catalytic moment was a series of photo shoots over the summer in the University Centre with 8 outliers. So the people that I had either come across or my research assistants came across on the street. Some people that I knew personally had a very distinctive style. So we shot them, and then we put together a launch event, and we applied then for school-based funding, which was approved. So we had our launch event of the second phase of the project in the Theresa Lang Centre last month on the 17th of February. So we had a conversation series amongst the outliers that came together for the first time and talked about their trajectory of dress. And we also had the first launch of the images. Sort of following up to that, I have also applied for an Aronson exhibition proposal, which has been accepted and is in work. So that's going to be next year's project. So I think I'm just sort of pointing to sort of the first book project being, having 3 strands of that in terms of curricular context and dissemination within the institution and impact at the curricular level, and then also dissemination to the field. And the second project has taken on sort of a life of itself in that it has 3 iterations now, where it's had a first outcome, it has had an event that's been launched and a conversation that's generated around that amongst our community as well and as individuals, and then now it's heading into that exhibition space. So utilizing all of those ways to really kind of grow something that became just from an initial idea and a very personal standpoint that is now growing out to having a much greater impact. And I think that the exhibition definitely, I have the goal to make those interdisciplinary links, not across persons, across the new school, and just really embedding really tangible ways that we can, connect this project into the curriculum across the university. So that is my trajectory. I'm sorry I was not clicking through as I should. So these are some of the images from the exhibition. I'll leave you with the last one of jumping Stephen Granarchia. Thank you so much.
It makes me nervous even standing up here in front of you doing this presentation. And so when I had to put together my dossier and I didn't know what it would look like, I found it incredibly nerve-wracking to try to curate and present a story that was compelling about who I am as a teacher and a faculty member and a service provider and an artist and designer. And I know that if you're going up for that now, you probably feel the same pressure of how to shape everything and tell a compelling story. I think that, putting my dossier together was a really interesting experience. It took about a month, and I was lucky that somebody I knew was able to share their dossier with me, so I had an idea of even how to organize it. And I'm not necessarily a word-based person. I'm more of a picture-based person. And luckily, I co-taught with John Roach, who taught me the practice of photographing and documenting and screen grabbing, which was really a lifesaver for me, like screen grab everything. And so I had a lot of material to gather to tell my story through my dossier. After I was reappointed, I sat on a renewable term appointment committee, and I realized how important it is to tell your story so that everybody can understand it. And the user that you're designing your dossier for is not really yourself. It's people that don't understand your practice. They don't understand your visual language or your written language, and it's very important to try to be clear and compelling with the information that you show. So, so a lot of thought about how to put things together. I luckily had a lot of material that came from doing presentations in school as a role of a full-time faculty member or as a program director. So I just thought I would show you some of the ways in which I organize my storytelling for different kinds of outcomes. And this is about Parsons working collaboratively with Van Tan Design Institute in Tokyo. A lot of the work I do is with external partners. There's collaborative, cross-school, cross-disciplinary partnerships with other faculty members. And I try to think really sequentially, like what happens first. Photographs are taken, photographs are edited, things are mocked up, layouts are made, they come in a sequence, there's a finish. It's really clear. I mean, I think that there are no words with that. I can now mine this for my next dossier. We do a lot of work on site with New York City public high school students, so I document site visits. I keep copies of students' work. I see what happens when the work finally goes back out into the world. So I really document everything. There are, I have a hard time keeping all my files straight. Like I have a lot of like current Parsons folder and personal practice folder, and things end up in different places. So we've done some fundraising work, sketch, screen print, produce, mock up, sell. Presentations, I photographed them. And I think you start to get an idea of, what the story is I'm telling. It's the one that's very engaged with student-based work. It's very engaged with community within the school. It's cross-disciplinary. It's about collaboration. It's about presentation. I have a couple pages from my dossier from before. I am a designer, so I set it up like a design project. I'm not a writer, so I had a very hard time personally writing 5 to 7 pages about myself. Everything I wrote, I thought sounded stilted and not compelling and too elementary. And I found that those 5 to 7 pages were extremely difficult. So I found it much easier to sort of put words with images, so there was a relationship between things. Personal practice work. I organized. I do a number of different things. Some exhibition work, some work with an artist, some nonprofit work, some school-based work. Now that I look at it, to be honest, I think it's completely too much information. I look at it and I think, there were 80 pages of this. So perhaps 40 pages would have been sufficient to tell this story. To be honest, I felt very apprehensive about how people would look at the work I do and how I would be assessed by it, because it's a really important time to share yourself with your colleagues and to put it right out there on paper. So I think if I did it, when I do it again, I'll simplify it and make it a little more pointed. But I was very careful throughout, the period going up to this, to save images, to tell complete stories about projects, whether it was a lab exercise where we did a sewing circle, or it was working with a high school on the Lower East Side with a lab class to create costumes for dangerous liaisons. And if it's an exhibition piece from my archives that ends up at MoMA, I make sure when I go, I photograph what the whole thing looks like, and I get up close, so I have a picture of the credit. Like, I don't want to miss anything, because I feel like I'll need it later as evidence of the story I'm telling about my practice.
Okay. Julia, did you take that picture of Lydia Lunch?
I did take that picture of Lydia Lunch.
What were the circumstances behind you taking that image?
I think, George, I've gotten to the point in my life where my career has come full circle, and I think there are a lot of ways in which I look at, I think when someone who's talking about pulling out which part of your life is your service and which part is your practice and which part is, your history. I found it really hard to separate those things. And I tried really hard, but I think, some of the work I do is, I feel like it's practice-based, even though it comes through a course project. My work from 35 years ago is now gaining some archival significance. So I luckily I documented and I saved all my stuff from before. And that picture of Lydia Lynch, I thought, great, it can be on my dossier. It's on my CV. It's traveled around the world. It's been in tons of museum shows. And I think, for me, it's one of 5,000 photos I took. It happens to have some currency that other people like. But to me, it's just a tiny, tiny part of my experience as a creative person. So I have lots of pictures of her.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm glad to know that I am participating in something probably, hopefully useful. Just to say a few words to start is that I believe that at the New School, if that helps at all, research really is not something that requires just skills, but also requires passion. And what we love about the New School is that it's exactly the case, I believe. So it's not driven by the formulas for promotion, but rather what one wants to achieve and one wants to become. Basically, figure out what you're good at and just go with it. If I were following a regular trajectory, I would be teaching War and Peace somewhere, 4 volumes of that whole Tolstoy masterpiece, and I just chose not to do it. So here I am not doing it. Because my fields now are international affairs, politics, Russian politics, media and journalism, and all these are very established and very competitive fields, and it's very nice to know that sometimes your contribution is being recognized. In some ways, I think what makes, probably that's why I was invited to speak here, was that I do approach these fields not from the academic perspective or traditional academic perspective, but sort of not as a matter of study, but more as a matter of practice. That is, for example, I don't teach journalism or writing. I actually do it. And then bring my expertise in writing journalism in 800 words. I figured out that that's I'm best at. Not necessarily great, but at least better than I'm in other forms of writing. And so that, of course, informs my teaching courses. Something that I wanted to show you, just to say that one should not be afraid to be ridiculous in academia, because at the New School it actually can get recognized. For example, my later fascination sort of grew out of interest in Russian politics and political culture, kind of made me interested in autocratic power all over the world, and was very much informed by Dick Cheney. I must say my favorite character. I think some people already are so tired of hearing me talking about my love for Dick Cheney, but indeed it is a love. And so Parsons faculty encouraged me to have an exhibition about this. And it was quite wonderful and remarkable. So we just closed the exhibition last week, which was called Romancing True Power. I really hope you will go online and find it, and it's on Facebook. And the reason what I wanted to show you, it's the worst thing to visual people describe things in words, but let me do it anyway. So Romancing True Power is about Dick Power, and it has strong men and strong women all around the world, and we sort of play on words, a dictator, D-I-C-K, dictator. And so we have Mount Rushmore, rather Mount Dickmore, and our four winners of who is the greatest dictators today, actually the 4 people, and I wanted to show you that picture. So the exhibition in general, it sounds silly, but it wasn't exactly silly, because it merged philosophy, propaganda, and politics of dictatorship with the architecture of how it works. And once again, that's sort of the New School provides us with, is to go off the beaten path and allow us to do things that we want to do, and then it gets appreciated. another thing that is interesting for me, as I said, 800 words is my preferred genre, is that I haven't written a peer review article in my life. However, I have almost 300 articles written in international publications, and that's what makes me, I guess, kind of an expert in my field, so to speak. I do write books, but not my favorite. However, I do that anyway. So I think that's sort of, in some ways, that what influences public opinion and conversation, for example, in my case about Russia, and I do hope about Dick Cheney soon enough, but about Russia, U.S. politics towards Russia, and because the opinions are valued, I mean, my opinions as it turn out to be valued, so it gets wider dissemination by various TV, radio commentaries. So I was asked to talk about how my work is validated. That's how it's being validated in a public forum in many ways. So what I was, I guess, trying to say is that traditional calculations of review process, of academic progress, really doesn't have to be as much. I mean, so 6, 7, 8 peer review articles or some such doesn't really have to be the norm and the standard, because the standard could be how we reach broad audiences. I mean, it is organized by Parsons, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. But in other divisions of the New School, it's not always the case, and I'm really grateful that, for example, my division in SPE actually recognizes this kind of, it's always called research interest. I just call it interest, because you do research what you love. So to conclude, you know, what takes constructing a dossier narrative, I've been on various promotion committees around the university for about 10 years. And it is important to mention that, you know, when you construct your narrative, you do create a trajectory to show how your work has expanded, but also how it has been consistent, because I think consistency is important. You may think that, you know, Dick exhibit has nothing to do with what I started with, but actually it does, because Russia has nothing but strong men, and it's obvious that my interest got expanded into the global world. Lily Ling is here, our Associate Dean of NSPE, and she always says that when you write the narrative, make sure that you present an arc of your development, and I really think it's very important, trajectory and an arc, and consistency of your inquiry and your evidence of intellectual growth, which is important. So basically, I think when I started with the Dick exhibit, I'm sorry, it's so fresh and it's just so exciting because we had over 300 people coming at various times to it, maybe 500 people, so it was quite exciting. When one thinks about one research, of course it has to be very critical and very serious, but I also, and it's one of my class requirements, almost goes first one, please have a sense of humor, because without a sense of humor you really cannot do the work that you know to do, you want to do. So it has to be daring and also fun and mischievous at the same time. Thank you.
I wanted to talk about the word established and the words research agenda. It's interesting, coming from a traditional photographic training in the 80s in California and Boston, there was always this battle between photography and where it might fit into the trajectory of art history, and how photographic history is now, of course, an established part of that discourse, even though you could see them as separate entities. So there's been an interesting journey for me in that process to this point. Then as the 90s hit and I was finishing graduate school and Photoshop was invented and Apple came forward with all of its wonderful opportunities and tools, the whole field shifted. So it was a very emerging and moving field at that time, prior and after my graduate studies and my training. So it's only in the last, I would say, 10 years that it feels like an established field. However, all of my work, I would say, is based in a discourse around painting and sculpture, even though it's photographic and video-based. So I think it's important to be able to recognize where one is placed within a very wide spectrum of possibility in terms of an art historical practice and a practice that uses many new media tools, but is defined within a particular set of historical precedents. Sorry, I don't have the images, but I work with landscape, still life, the body, portraiture, and a variety of very established themes, even though it's using new media. And I think that's really important to think about, for me at least. So if there are any questions about that, I'd be happy to talk about it. But I also wanted to point out that since I got tenure, I did feel that there was a certain freedom, I think, to move beyond the research agenda that I had established. And it sort of opened up, I think, a kind of freedom that allowed me to explore an even wider spectrum. So I think we have to think about maybe before and after. So there you have it. Thank you. George.
You drew attention to the fact that you practice video and photography, but you also referred to painting and sculpture and its importance to you. Is there any reason why you made that correlation?
Well, I think with photography in particular, because it's so wide-ranging, I think one should define a position within that spectrum in order to be understood from an outside perspective as far as where you situate yourself within all of those possibilities, as opposed to, say, photojournalism or documentary practice or a pursuit of truth in a particular way. And mine is perhaps considered more of a poetic pursuit than a documentary one.
Thank you.
Should I start, Tom?
Please, yeah, I'm going to try to get us in. Do you need the internet?
No, I don't need anything, and I except this seat because Sarah Lawrence kept me up way too late last night. And sorry, Anthony, because I talked to Anthony yesterday and I said, "You're not showing slides, are you?" So I sabotaged his presentation. And Nina, thanks so much for that fabulous show. I'm an architect, so I really understand dick power. You know, you don't have more well-established fields than architecture. So that is both the benefit of the burden of entering into this particular university and the renewal and promotion process. Architecture was one of numerous happy accidents in my life. I had no idea what to be an architect was. I'm first generation university, so certainly my parents didn't have any idea what an architect was. So I was hedging my bets and also was a math major, like my two older brothers. My fourth year in architecture school at Syracuse University, I had the advantage of attending the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies here in New York in 1978. And it made me realize that architecture was not a profession, but it was a discipline and a discourse that touched everything in our lives very directly. And so from this inspirational moment, I decided to go to graduate school and picked the most esoteric and unpractical one I could possibly think of, which was Princeton. You know, I had a few debts, so I decided I could rely on the architecture profession as a professional field and worked for 5 years in an office on Union Square West. And somehow, magically, the turn of events came back to have an office a block away from that 25 years later. I enter into this process from an established discipline, but very latecomer to full-time academia. 2007, I started practicing architecture in 81 and teaching in 86. But along the way, some of the happy accidents that happened was, I mean, I love drawing. Drawing was the first medium. I was taught that architects draw and conceive of the building and someone else builds it. But I found myself in the middle of the East Village where the architecture of the city was crumbling apart. So I was like building my own space, carving it out of tenement, and my art friends, dancers and graffiti artists, helping them with their lofts and space. And so I got very interested in the material practice and design and build and architecture, but also the transformation of the city when something like electronic trading on Wall Street happens. At the same month, I graduated from architecture school. So the world had changed the moment I graduated architecture school, and I had no idea what was happening around me, but somehow I was struggling. So that change took 10 years to enter architecture school. So when I started teaching at Parsons in 1991, there was this funny white box called a Mac that they said, okay, you teach drawing, so you have to learn the computer. So there was a beta software called FormZ. I said, this was really cool. I'll learn this. And there was an 18-year-old guy from Argentina who taught me the software in 2 weeks. And so I integrated it into my teaching. And from that, I started teaching at Columbia where they introduced paperless studios. And I developed a practice that was identified as a digital artist in the Ars Electronica Festival in 2000 and Linz, Austria, and I was like, why are you calling this digital architecture? It was a project for the Skyscraper Museum where I was just through three-dimensional and time-based modeling explaining the history of the skyscraper as a kind of archaeology of capitalism in Manhattan. So I think, because I'm down to 21 seconds, the lesson is, whatever you started off with is an incredible basis, but the openness and imagination to what's happening around you socially, culturally, technologically, jump into it and define your practice based on that point in time in history that you happen to come to and come in age to, and describe that as part of your narrative. So without being too me, I mean, to really construct your work around a story about your life and your discipline and how you shape that discipline through your life experience. Thank you.
I just thought it would be useful as telling a story through images that, as Brian was just pointing out, I feel that my work was entirely influenced by what was going on in terms of technology in the late 80s, early 90s, as you can see here, for example, in this image. This is the first Apple laptop.
That's me.
So there was for the entire lead up to the writing of my dossier, this image could be seen, I guess, as emblematic of the story that I wrote in terms of how my relationship to my practice and to art history and to emerging photographic practices was a back and forth relationship between our engagement with the tools and the meaning that was being shaped by them and hopefully influencing it in the other direction as well. So I'm not going to go into too much detail in terms of my own image history, but I just thought if you maybe look at the thumbnails briefly in this page, you can see, as I was talking about in terms of the body and the portrait and the still life and architecture, but I'm not an architect, but I deal poetically with issues around space and the body, as you can see here. I think that's the office, the hallway to my office made of human skin. So fortunately, we all work at an institution that has learned how to understand and appreciate the value of this kind of work, even though it's not traditional research-based work. I'm not out to solve any real problems or dilemmas, but to add to them and complicate them through my work. So there you go. Thank you.
So here you see. Because we had one of the things that we made up, and we really just went all the way, because at the exhibition where 300 people came or more, I mean, at the reception, we served dick wine and dick M&Ms and all sorts of various dick things. So we had POID, bring your own beer, pick your own dick. So Erdogan took most votes. He's a man from Turkey. The three kings from North Korea, they took the second place. Vladimir Putin, my man, was in the third place, and Mao Zedong, who killed the most people, actually, he was the fourth. So anyway, this is, I just wanted to give it as an example that also, this also counts as academic practice.
Can I add one thing to, just because I work collaboratively as an artist, which is also perhaps something that I know I have colleagues, for example, who also work collaboratively within the art world. I know it varies from one field to another. I think it's something that needs to be clearly and carefully articulated and presented in terms of where we position ourselves within any type of collaborative practice. Mine has been going on for 25 years with my partner, who I met in graduate school, so all of the work that you saw projected is the result of our collaborative artistic practice. And that's just, I mean, we can talk more in detail about that, but I think it's something to think about if you're also involved.
How do you position that collaborative practice? How do you describe it in terms of your narrative or dossier?
The work wouldn't exist without the conversation that we started 25 years ago. It would be two completely different, independent bodies of work. Everything that was up there is the result of a combined effort to understand the environment that we find ourselves in.
Brian, do you think that technology activated your work or drove the work, or it was a partner in your work?
Oh, it distracted me from building, which I have mixed feelings about. But I'm happily in an environment where that aspect of architecture is privileged. I did want to add something about, and maybe this is true of other disciplines, but architecture is a long-standing discipline, and it's normalized in certain university contexts. Every other school that I was involved in, Syracuse, Princeton, Columbia, teaching for 16 years, there's a School of Architecture, a Faculty of Architecture, and it has a role within the liberal arts. And so here it's buried in something called the School of Constructed Environments, which has architecture, interior design, lighting design, product design, industrial design, within the 5-school structure of Parsons, and with a relationship with the new school that nobody really understands on the street if you ask them. So I think we all face that dilemma of not just articulating how we are positioned within the discipline, but how, and I think Nina spoke to that really beautifully about the new school, how the new school also provides a way for us to collectively challenge certain disciplinary boundaries. And so I think that's really important.
Could I just add to that last remark, because I do think the new school is very open, but I wouldn't want to romanticize our positions here within an institution that does have a fairly well-defined and continually defining set of guidelines for how to provide evidence of those accomplishments, especially with emerging fields, but that's perhaps another discussion for another panel in terms of emerging. We are fortunate, I guess, because we're on the established panel, so it makes it perhaps somewhat more direct in terms of defining our positions within those fields. But it's a lot of work, and to do it right, it takes consideration in terms of understanding what established is, established galleries, established writers, established publications. I think the word is a good one to really understand where our stories emerge from.
Well, as we step into the next couple of panels, I guess a good question would be, how do any of the three of you see that bridge being built between New School and Parsons and kind of more traditional fields and that sense of innovation? Where do you see those partnerships in terms of art?
Since I'm not from Parsons, I guess I would be answering this question. So I am all about words and images, however, only in terms of looking at them from this spectator side. and discussing them from that point of view. And there are two colleagues at Parsons who completely changed my view. I don't know where I'm going to go with that, but two conversations that I had with Parsons faculty over the years, a couple of years before, and I was talking about Dick Cheney. Please forgive me, I'm really obsessed. I was talking about Dick Cheney, and they said, we want an exhibit about this. And I was like, what? I'm sorry, I'm going to write a book about this. And said, no, we want an exhibit about this. And connected me to a colleague, an architect, who used to be a Parsons affiliate, I think, Surgeon Weiss. So he was also obsessed with similar issues. So I think that openness allows us to have collaborations we didn't even think would be possible. And, as you were talking about the 90s and the 80s, my degree was in comparative literature. As I said, I would be teaching 4 volumes in War and Peace. From my point of view, in a country that doesn't like to read as much as, say, Europe likes to read. So I actually didn't want to find myself in that position. So you open yourself up, but with more, you said that sort of you react to what contemporary world requires you to react to. And somehow today, it does seem remarkable that my little ideas about Dick Cheney connected to the ideas of Parsons faculty, and suddenly we had this really very popular exhibition. And I think what we try to do and we need to do is that to be absolutely open to this conversation, and not in the formula of academic conversation, but just a regular coffee conversation. I'm interested in this, and somehow this would come together. And I think without really celebrating the new school does allow it to happen. I was just speaking in Boston, and they said, you had an exhibit on this? We would never have done this. Like, of course you wouldn't, you're in Boston. So I think something, and not often we feel that the new school is the greatest university in the world. I mean, we do feel that, but we have to convince others. I actually did feel like the new school was the greatest university in the world because it allows you to do things that others would be afraid or wouldn't even think of doing because it's just too trite. But actually, it's not.
But Nina, it's what you're saying is so important, and I saw Surgeon's proposal before he met you. So I can speak to the value of the majority of the people in this room who I can recognize at Parsons having those conversations across disciplines because, of course, he's an architect, so he had this wonderful collection of strange monuments across Eastern Europe. But through the conversation with you, I think it became much more alive and bringing in the political figures as opposed to the architectural representations of power just gave the whole project, his project, another dimension, another openness to different kinds of discussions. So I think it's a great way to encourage those in this room to make those kind of risks, take those kind of risks.
So this is Erin. I'm an associate professor in strategic design management. While I was organizing themes and panels, one thing that came up in my mind is that, I actually was never given an opportunity to speak about my research beyond a very small group of people in my department. So I thought that, it would be, again, a nice opportunity to share what I do, and then maybe using my own research to again, discuss, what it takes to establish some evidence and validity of what you do, particularly when you do something, pursuing something that was not traditionally considered as the typical research topics in your field. Again, a little bit about myself. Well, I started as a design student a long time ago. I did fashion design for my undergraduate and master's degrees. However, I pursued management. For my PhD, I worked on supply chain management and consumer behavior. So my professional career, particularly my career in academia, has been centered around the issues related to branding or brand strategy, supply chain, particularly in the context of e-commerce and consumer behavior. Again, looking at consumers' evaluation process. The process is involved in design evaluation in particular, and also investigate the impact of this design evaluation on consumer choices. Another area that I do is something called design-led strategy. I mean, this is trying to find ways and experimenting ways in which design method and design principles can be applied to innovation process, and things of this kind of how highly important issues and high relevance to many things happening in the current marketplace. So I was lucky enough to be invited by companies like Samsung, LG, SK Telecom, and Hyundai, even Kia, in their innovation process as an advisory role, and sometimes I got involved in their project in the ideation stages. Through this experience, I got to be, exposed to and learn a lot more about technological and engineering aspects of, product development, and this opportunity actually gave me, and inspired me to pursue something that could allow me to fuse all these technological aspects into pursuing my research, which has been situated in the social science domain. So I've been experimenting many different things, and this is one of those, design neuroscience. I mean, there has been much research done trying to figure out, the impact, the ways we evaluate a particular design, and try to understand why that particular aspects of design is important in consumers' decision making. However, these researchers have been utilizing mostly surveys and experiments, trying to obtain the consumer subjective evaluation. So basically what they did was to collect the data, asking consumers to indicate the extent to which they agree or disagree with a particular set of questions. I mean, there are some issues that can be easily answered through this methodology. However, when it comes to emotions or unconscious process, I mean, things become very difficult. So this is one of the things I wanted to fuse a bit more, so to speak, scientific and engineering focused methodology in terms of obtaining data that will allow me to figure out and also get into a bit deeper understanding of how and what actually goes on in consumers' mind. That design is important in consumer choice doesn't need elaboration. There are many studies done already indicating that good design actually triggers many different positive emotions, such as it increased the immediate desire to own. Again, good design increased the willingness to pay, and people have a tendency to provide more care, better care of the product if the design of the product is good, and also they tend to treasure the product long after its functional value fades. The role of design is particularly important as the functional aspects of alternatives are getting similar. There have been actually many research done, in the neuroscience field, trying to understand consumers' aesthetic evaluation. So studies like this, contributed greatly to our understanding in terms of figuring out the neural correlates of beautiful faces or beautiful geometric shapes, or the neural basis of aesthetic preferences for painting and pictures, and also try to understand that the brain correlates of those who have a particularly keen eyes in terms of athletics. However, the issue is that, there aren't many studies done looking into or trying to, provide the deeper understanding of the athletic aspects of product design. So that's the space that I wanted to go in using this approach. Well, I should say that it's been very difficult, to say the least. Pursuing this obviously requires special expertise and then also capacity in terms of machines and all those things, which our school does not have. We don't have engineering division, nor the medical division. I really had no internal resources to tap into. So, and at the same time, it is very difficult for almost a novice in this field, stepping in to the already established network of people and trying to sort of be part of the projects that's already going on. So I thought about this issue for a long time. I wanted to pursue something in this space for a long time, but the opportunity didn't come until about 3 years ago. It was just pure luck that I was introduced to a group of research team at the medical center in one of the universities in Korea, and it just happened that the head of the department was highly interested in pursuing some social science aspects. Social science topics that can be verified and validated through the means of fMRI and all other medical equipment. So I was able to be part of the team. I was invited as a research fellowship, providing some statistical analysis and also trying to get more understanding of how the research of this kind can be actually done. But for me to pursue my own research, one of the most important things was to secure funding. And I, faced this chicken and egg situation where, for me to carry out my own research, I needed funding. For me to get the funding, I need to show the evidence. So again, it was a very, very challenging situation. However, I managed to come up with the arrangement where if I contribute a bit, however small that may be, if I can contribute a bit, the other party is going to match the portion so that it amounts to a certain amount of money that is enough to collect the data from a minimum number of subjects. So I applied for the provost funding support at New School. But unfortunately, I got rejected based on the ground that I don't necessarily have the evidence or a capacity to pursue this. And then I applied for a very small amount of funding at my school, which ended up cutting in half even. But again, was able to secure some. So using this, the other party actually doubled the contribution, the amount that double the amount that they promised. So we were able to, do something. So with this, I really tried to work hard on evidence building aspects. So I conducted a research, wrapped it together and be able to present this in many different conferences. And I was, able to make a good publication out of this work. The publication in several different places. And then I was invited one day as a keynote speaker for a conference in sensory and neuromarketing science. And then it led me to another opportunity, and it went on. So what I'm saying is that, it's difficult. It's difficult to first of all show that you do have an ability and again, qualification and capacity to do something that you've never actually done before. However, I guess the approach that that I could recommend based on my experience is that you just be tenacious and try to make a little progress, however small that may be, progress as much as you can. Things add on to the ones that you do, and then it goes to eventually it goes to the place that you can do something about in terms of many different things necessary for you to pursue even further. Thank you so much.
I'm Tim Aronson, and I'm Assistant Professor of Fashion Design and Sustainability in the School of Fashion at Parsons, and also the Program Director of the two AAS programs, one in Fashion Design, one in Fashion Marketing. And I'm going to briefly talk about my PhD research and positioning and validating your research when your research often looks like this. I have a saying that I always eventually end up on the floor. And so my PhD was on what has since then become called zero-waste fashion design. So designing clothes in a way that does not waste any of the fabric that's being used to cut the clothes. So the industry average for all of the things that we're wearing here today, the industry average is about 15% of the fabric that's used to make these things is wasted. So in my PhD, I positioned it as a design problem and set out to investigate how to design clothes in a way that didn't waste any fabric. And it was, I started my PhD back in 2004 and back in Australia, and there weren't a whole lot of PhDs just in fashion design in general, and even fewer in the area of fashion design and sustainability. So it was very much an emerging field at the time. There were no books, which actually already posed one of the challenges for positioning the research, because it wasn't like there was a field that, other than sort of the broader field of design and sustainability, that was really the context in which I positioned my research. But I also recognized very early on that I had to bring it into the field of fashion as well. And so one of the strategies that I used was to place my research in a historical context, and I actually did look at a lot of historical examples of garments from around the world and also from different eras, which straight away started, it led to some tensions in some of the responses that I got to my research, because particularly historians of dress from around the world and also some academics who theorized about dress, for them, the way in which I talked about clothes from different cultures and different eras, it wasn't something that was done. And really, I was looking at these garments, as you can see, from the point of view of what did they actually look like as two-dimensional pieces of fabric, because that was really what I was setting out to investigate. And that was really the common theme that ran through in all of the things that I looked at, including things like this from Italy, from the teens. This was an Italian futurist artist who designed this overall in 1919 and intended it for everyday wear. And he did apparently sell thousands of them. But again, the cut of the tutu or the overall really related to the actual fabric that it was made from in a different way to how I was taught to design clothes and how I was taught to make clothes. And I kept finding different examples. This is really just a very quick snapshot. Some of you might be familiar with the work of Bernard Rudowski. He, among other things, he was very critical of the Western way of making clothing, as well as Western architecture at times and certain furniture as well. With clothing, he actually launched, based on his research, and he had an exhibition at the Met in the late 40s, or mid-40s, from 44 to 45, called Art Clothes Modern. And based on that research, he actually launched a clothing line in the early 50s, which didn't last for very long, but he had it for a couple of years. And you can see from the diagrams that the clothes, again, were very sort of basic and just really just worked with the fabric that he had at hand. And so with the 20th century practitioners that I found, it was I really positioned myself in amongst those practitioners. So starting with Tayat and then moving on to Bernard Rudowski, and then later on designers like Sandra Rhodes in the UK and Yao Li Teng here in New York. And one of the best pieces of advice that somebody gave me early on in my PhD was to blog about my research. And I mean, this was back in 2006 I started blogging, and blogging was still a fairly new thing then. And I nonetheless did, and I think I had, I don't know, less than 10 readers for the first few years. But nonetheless, one of the best things that came out of the blog was actually I started to find, or rather people who had similar interests to me started to find me. And one of those people was an academic from New Zealand, Holly Mcquillen, and this is some of her work from a few years ago. And this was not just about positioning myself in amongst all these practitioners anymore. This also became part of the validation process, because for context, when I started my PhD in 2004, I was accepted into the program, which in hindsight wasn't really even a program. It was just, there were a few of us doing PhDs, but that really was the extent of the program. But then it was quite telling that one of my advisors, I was probably 3 or 4 months into my research when she actually realized what my research was about. And I also, when I shared about my research with both industry and other academics, sometimes the response would be very enthusiastic, but at times it was also very critical and very skeptical. What's the point of this kind of practice, and is it even possible, and is it economically viable, and so forth. And so finding people like Holly Mcquillen was particularly validating, because it was a moment where I actually found someone else who was thinking about the same thing. So for anyone starting their research, I would encourage to start sharing about that research fairly early on, even when the ideas aren't necessarily fully formed yet. I think it's important to engage in dialogue with your peers about the things that are coming up for you. And then just finally another researcher who's just finished his PhD on pattern making or pattern cutting, Ricard Lindquist. And so that's been an interesting thing that's really emerged during my PhD. So I went the long way. I started in 2004 and finished in 2012. And it was an amazing 8 years. But in that time, a number of other researchers started to engage in researching not just fashion design, but also pattern cutting. So the relationship between the two-dimensional pattern and the three-dimensional garment. So just on validating, how do you try and bring validities to something that on the ground often looks like this? So the way that I did my PhD, I actually designed a series of garments during my PhD project, and throughout I kept a reflective design journal, and you can see 2 pages here. And by the end of the project, or by the end of the practical part of the project, I actually ended up with 400 pages of this journal, which I then transcribed all of it. For lack of any better software, I actually did it in Excel, and did the coding in Excel, and used Excel to do the analysis of the data as well. And really, this was the data that I was analyzing. And from this, so basically it was a form of grounded theory that I used. And from the analysis, I built a theory of zero-weight fashion design, and that really became the final dissertation. And all of this, or rather the Excel spreadsheet of this is all available online, because that was actually part of bringing validity to it, making the design processes as transparent as possible. So, as I mentioned, I think actually writing about the research and sharing it on the blog was another very useful strategy to bring validity and to the research, because I think by actually inciting debate about your research, I think, can be a very useful strategy. It's not always comfortable, because I had some very, very uncomfortable responses and reactions to my research along the way, but all of it nonetheless was very useful in helping me form some of the arguments that I eventually formed. And exhibiting has been another very useful strategy. So in 2008, I had my first exhibition from my PhD research of garments that I'd created as part of my PhD, and I've been fortunate enough to exhibit several times a year since then in different venues around the world. And this is from one exhibition in 2011. And writing has come up a few times, and starting with the blogging, writing has been incredibly important in just, I regard writing as a form of craft for myself. It's almost like a form of making alongside the actual making of the clothes, because it allows me to process the thoughts that emerge during the design process in a different way. And not that everybody has to publish books. There's, as has already emerged today, there's different venues for writing, and I'm very much of the opinion that it doesn't always have to be the academic article either. There's other forms of writing and different places and different avenues for writing that I think, particularly in the creative fields, are very, very important and very valid. So I'm actually going to leave it at that, and maybe we get to questions at the end. So thank you very much.
So my name is Vlad Mccollich. I'm an associate professor at the School of Media Studies at NSPE. And actually, where do I start here? I've been at the New School for quite a while, so I also can, actually tell you a lot about because I went through the first process actually. When was it, 2006 or 2007? I was actually, my contract was up then, so we were the first ones to go, the first group of faculty to go for applying for tenure EE. And there was no renewable term appointment. It was just like a 3-year term and out. And everything was up or out. So that was the first year when it all happened. Before that, I actually was an adjunct teaching here and in other places, and by profession, I'm a practitioner, I'm a filmmaker. My films are what you would describe as art house, feature, or documentary films that play in festivals, get released in some limited theatrical in the US and around the world. I actually have a film just coming out now. So at the time where I was actually submitting my evidence and my dossier and so on, I was doing this as a filmmaker primarily, which also was interesting. It was not an emerging field, obviously, but at that time at the New School, it wasn't really defined. I was actually the first one in a practitioner, one of the first faculty members from a practitioner perspective, because then it was really, the whole process was geared primarily towards research, academic research. So it was really a challenge to just kind of position what you do within that context and what is the evidence. Obviously, you show your work, films. In my world, again, this is festivals, press, reviews, and so on. But I think what is probably more relevant here is what I have done since. So my status is extended employment, because at that time, we were advised that, as a practitioner, you don't even think about going for tenure, because that's not really something that was at that time set up. One thing also I can speak to is because since then I was, in the first group there was like a handful of us who got that promotion then. We were on a lot of these committees, university and division-wide and so on. So it's really interesting to see, it's really as much as what you do, how do you position the narrative, and because you have to, again, from the perspective of sitting on these committees, is that oftentimes there are other faculty members who really don't understand the discipline that you're working with. And especially in these type of emerging fields. Now, when I say emerging fields, what I've done since is, so one of the fields that I've been heavily involved, actually, what I've done before is I was one of the first feature films that was done on digital, which is in '96. And I said, actually at that time I was teaching adjunct classes here, and I said we should have a digital filmmaking course. And everybody told me, what are you talking about? It's digital and film are two different things, so. But this is, I think, what Nina was talking about before. Luckily, it's the New School. So they just let you do it. And said, okay, try it, And of course, the class filled up within a day. And then we had like 5 sections open. And the next thing was, at this point, historically speaking, the New School is the first university that probably offered a digital filmmaking class. Like, I think with many other things. So that's the great thing about this place. So, this was kind of one of the areas which then became something that because I like kind of films that are a little challenging or in different ways, that it's not just the, commercial Hollywood aspect, otherwise I probably wouldn't be teaching here. So, then in 2007, I did a film called Zenith, which had a huge, what is called transmedia campaign around it, which means the film was the centerpiece, and then we did an elaborate campaign of spreading the content of the film across multiple media platforms. And this was something that at that time was still very new. It's a term that comes out of academia. Actually, it was used by Henry Jenkins initially from MIT to coin a phrase of really investigating fan-based, how fans reappropriate movies and, then turn them back onto multiple media forms. Since then has been, appropriated by a lot of other media makers to describe a practice of just spreading content across multiple media forms for a variety of reasons. One of them being, of course, that we have different technologies now, that we're kind of expanding the format of what was traditional filmmaking, et cetera. So this in itself is a very, this is the challenge I think that, is probably the most what we're talking about here, which is an emerging field. So how do you talk about this where there is really not, much literature or precedent to go on? So one of the things, I think what has been said already is, of course, documenting everything that you do. One of the things that I did then, because, is actually to reconnect with a lot of other practitioners and do research who were doing similar things. And actually then, which is interesting, some of the people who I knew who have been in the forefront of this whole digital thing in the 90s, now we're doing transmedia. And so we did actually a conference at the New School. Again, one of the things was called at that time DIY Days. We invited a lot of practitioners and some academics to talk about transmedia and other aspects of it, and which again helped in terms of both again documenting these things and what you do and how does it impact, what kind of impact it has. The thing with the project, in generally, because of course everything that I do is project driven, so it's always to kind of position it within what is the narrative in terms of a broader field. So, where does this fit and why is this important? Why is this relevant? And I think that becomes the key issue, So first for even, how would you explain this, for example, to somebody who, I don't know, is an economist or something who, so how would you explain the significance of, what you do and how does it fit within that field and what is new or, interesting about it, et cetera. The other point of this is, of course, also to just keep everything that you can in terms of artifacts, in terms of what was said before, writing, blogs, what other people have written, et cetera, in terms of documentation, which is the evidence to it, of course, what you have been doing. So I guess I'll leave it here again, open to all kinds of questions. As I said, I've seen many of these dossiers on the functions of these committees, and it makes a huge difference. Just it's kind of, you can sometimes see that something that's really strong, but kind of fails to connect the narrative, to explain it well. Thanks.
Yeah, people create things. People often, we've heard this today, people often work on projects or create things or do research, but how do you position it in your field, or how would you suggest people approach building that narrative and validate, individually validate?
For me, I think what is important is first to present the field. So in this case, for example, if I would talk about transmedia, I would first talk about, what is the significance of it, which means the traditional model of, mass media production and how it's changing because of the technology. And within that, what part transmedia plays. So there's several different new methodologies and technologies, and transmedia is one of them. And where does it fit in there? For one, as a discipline, so while it's not yet clearly defined, but it is, as an emerging field, it's already has the advantage of innovation. So that's a big plus, and it's already, what are the other, if there are other projects or other people doing similar things or have written about this, and then for me, for example, what I have done and how does this relate to, so how does my own output in the production relate to these fields, and what is the potential contribution to that?
To the filmmaker, does commercial success have any value in the status of your talent?
It's one of the aspects, but it's not something that you would look at, because again, when we look at, for the purpose of this, right? So you're presenting a dossier, and you're presenting something that evaluates the innovation or the impact of your work. So you know, I mean, something can be commercially successful, but it's really not, you know, I mean, of course it will have an, you know, it will serve as evidence, but I think if it's something that moves the field forward or is, you know, has innovation within the field is actually more significant than something that has made a lot of money.
Are you more dependent then on critical reviews as opposed to...
Absolutely. You know, this is what I say, it's like, for example, as a, you know, it's interesting because I think, you know, again, when I was preparing my dossier, you know, I think it was 2006 or whatever it was, but, you know, it was basically, my evidence then were festivals and critical reviews. If I would do this for the transmedia aspect now, of course, you know, I have, you know, when we did the film, we do have, again, critical reviews and so on, but what is interesting, we got, you know, an enormous amount of write-ups about what we have done in terms of transmedia. So it's not just, so I could actually, which with a regular film, you know, it's like, okay, it's a film, you have, you know, critical reviews are good, or you played at these festivals, but here what's really interesting is that people, critics or, you know, even academics were writing about how this is interesting what you're doing and it's groundbreaking. So this is what I'm saying is like, so, but for that to happen, of course, you have to put this type of project out there so that people can discuss it.
So is the film being in a festival that's been juried part of it, or would it be the same as somebody picked it up for distribution or for the pattern making or other areas? Is it your process being adapted?
It is, of course, you know, this is also something, you know, again, being on the other side now and in these review committees is, of course, there are always people who are from your field. So, you know, it's one thing if you say I've played in, I don't know, the Berlin Film Festival, or I played in the, you know, Williamsburg Film Festival. So, you know, it's clear what the significance is of different things. So, you know, juried festivals, and in that sense, you know, there is a certain level of recognition that is understood within the practitioners within a particular field.
In my case, I think one of the sources of validation has been the industry itself, both here in the US and also in other parts of the world, where once I've started to you know, share about the research, and particularly through sort of non-academic channels, because most fashion brands do not read Fashion Theory or the Fashion Practice Journal. So more mainstream media has been useful in that. But for me, it's been, I mean, both personally validating, but also I think validating for the research itself and for the topic and the area itself, is having genuine interest from brands of different sizes and also from different locations around the world. Like right now, I'm in conversations with, I think, 3 companies that want to explore how they could implement at least some of those ideas. And it's really challenging because I'm coming up for my review, so I'll be putting in my dossier in June. And so how do you put in a conversation with a brand in when you've signed an NDA with them? Because I mean, I probably can, and I can probably get permission to do that as long as it's kept, because the dossiers are confidential as far as I'm understanding. But because to me it is validating, but then I've also signed an NDA with them, and so it does raise some questions that I've not yet answered.
For me, particularly regarding the project that I talked about today, it was more for the dissemination in academic journals. I mean, I have a few other projects that have more values to industries as opposed to, you know, building up my academic credential. However, what I like to say is that, you know, this validation, positioning my new approach, is still something that I have to struggle with. I mean, very recently I submitted the proposal, the paper manuscript to a conference in my field. Again, it came rejected based on the ground that they have nobody to be able to evaluate the work that I submitted. But luckily, what I have been experiencing is that folks in the neuroscience field, they are more open to new ideas, new approach, as long as the methodology and then the technical aspects that built into is up to their standard, has the right approach to go about. And that's how I have these publications in places like neuroscience and neuro reports. So I guess for now, that's the space, that's the direction that I like to bring in terms of situating this new work. But eventually, I will work, and it would be very nice if the people in my space would be able to recognize it as a valid form of conducting research in that space.
I'm just wondering because for Timo, for example, writing is one form of validation, obviously for spreading out, putting out your research. So you have the critical writing, say, for academic journals, but then you also have trade, for example, and then you have blogs. So in the range of writing, they all require different tones and different ethos, I guess, so to speak. So, it's good that you actually can address all three. And I would imagine you adjust your writing for each of those audiences, right?
Absolutely. The audience, considering the audience when you're writing is critical. Because you need to, there's an intention to reach a particular audience with the writing. My blog, I would say, it's a Sunday morning rant. That's usually when things get written on there, and I don't particularly self-censor myself. I've written things on there that occasionally get me into trouble, particularly with the industry, because I just write what's there to be said and then don't think about it any further. But sometimes years later, even this year I've had people call me out on things that I wrote in 2008, which is really exciting, because I could go in and edit things, but I think it's important for me it's important personally to keep a record of the thoughts as they were 7 years ago. But in this field, I see it as an emerging field. So it was interesting when I wrote the first conference paper about my research 10 years ago in 2005. And even then I was considering the audience, but it was actually, the audience was almost unknown at that point, because I didn't know who the other people were that I was even writing to. So there was, and that's something that's refined for me over the years, I have a much better sense now. Every time I write, I have a much clearer sense now who I'm writing to.
I guess what I didn't want to discount the criticality of a blog, because sometimes the academic ones are actually more superficial. I don't know. It's the immediacy of what you're talking about when you're doing a blog. It may be uncensored or maybe unfiltered, but probably somebody has to sift through that and realize it actually has much more content. I don't know. So I'm just saying that all three forms of writing, whatever, have also different, both the good, critical, as well as the maybe not, sometimes you don't have to take it too seriously.
Yes, and actually, you're pointing to, I think, a very important conversation too, which is, in my view, very important, just the notion of dissemination in the creative fields. Because how do you actually write about, for me, for fashion design, it's an emotional process as well. But then when you write an academic article, you're meant to take this very objective and, I would say, cold tone in a way. Like the passion that is part of the process, you need to kind of leave that out. And I have experimented with that as well. I wrote an article with 2 colleagues 2 years ago where we actually said in the first paragraph, we said, this looks like an academic article, but really it's not, because we actually spoke in first person. We spoke of the emotional experience of designing and also the emotional experience of the failures in the design process, because to us that was really important to be able to communicate that to other practitioners who were engaging in research. That just to say that it's actually okay to screw it up and you actually can grow from all of that as well. But I think it's a really necessary conversation to be having about some of the academic traditions in the creative fields, like how well do they actually fit and work for us.
Could I just make a point? I would absolutely agree about having a diversity of forms of dissemination as is appropriate to the work, and follow Lucille's point. But I think it's also really important thinking about audiences when one comes to construct a dossier, a review document inside an institution, to frame that work also for that audience, because otherwise the forms can maybe not have the power or the agency that they should have. So I mean, I'm just speaking about the importance of the author, putting together that other narrative for that other audience, and that's their responsibility. Because, for example, the blog doesn't necessarily speak the same language as the academic article, as we've said, but I think then the author must take that responsibility for placing the work, because we are still existing within traditional forms, even in this very non-traditional university.
So I guess I would consider the dossier a fourth form of writing.
Yeah,
I mean, if you look at it that way, because the other three that I mentioned is really for the general public, for the world. And then the dossier is a very insulated, I mean, it's much more, prescribed, so to speak.
Timo, I have a question and concern about vocabulary and the use of the word validation when discussing your blogging. And in the context of this workshop, is that really what we mean by validation? Or is that a self-validation? Or is it a dissemination or an explication of your work? I would assume that validation refers to external validation.
Yeah.
So I'm a little concerned that the term is being used in a way that is not at all what I had assumed it to mean.
That's a very good question, and I guess what I was pointing to is that it was an access to dialogues that serve towards validating. What I mean is, particularly when Holly Mcquillen found my research through my blog, because at that point I'd written two academic articles about my work, which weren't in sort of they weren't particularly easy to find for anyone. So the blog became an access to other people who were working in the same field of finding me. And I guess the validation that I'm referring to was that it then became clear that there was a community of people around the world who were working on the same topic. So that's really because I wouldn't say that the things that I actually put on the blog at times were validating anything, but it helped as an access to those people. I don't know if that's making sense.
So you're saying it led to opportunities for validation?
Yeah, because in my view, just discovering that there is a community of people looking at the same things, asking the same kinds of questions, that was a moment of validation for me. And equally, I would say, I went to a number of conferences to speak about my research, and finding people in those settings was also, so it was really finding the community of researchers who were asking the same questions. And that, to me, is, and maybe it was because there was so much skepticism around my particular research area when I started, that finding the other people asking the questions, because it was such a new field, and in my experience of it was when I started, I was the only one asking those questions, and then finding the other ones, that was a validation of the research itself. I don't know if that makes sense.
I'm still not buying it, but it's simply to say I'm a painter and I've just discovered that there are other people who are painters doesn't necessarily validate my painting.
I would disagree that mine was much more specific than that, because I'm not saying that I discovered other fashion designers doing research through my blog. I actually found other fashion designers asking, is it possible to design a garment without wasting any fabric? That's who I actually found, and that's where it became possible to actually start a discourse and dialogue about that, which I wasn't when it was just me and my PhD advisor. It was a fairly close conversation up until that point.
But that allows you to situate what you're doing within a field of similar practitioners. But situating your work is not the same as it being validated.
Sure. I may choose to disagree because I do think that when you recognize that there is a field, even if it may be a field of 5 people around the world, to me that is one source, and it certainly wasn't the only source of validation, but it is one of them for the research itself. And like I said before, I think it was partly having both academics and industry really question the point of the research, like why would you even do that? I think that's where I'm coming from with the validation.
If I could interject, it seems like a question of relevance or saliency of your research question.
Sure. And maybe that was a poorly chosen word.
Well, possibly. But I think I see where you're getting. That there's a community of scholars and practitioners, and there's a certain breadth of common understanding that this is a research question worth addressing. Yes. Yeah.
But thank you. That's a question very well taken.
Thank you so much.